This is Lecture 124A in the ABCs of Communism series that accompanies Volume 7 forthcoming on Communism in Europe. We've gotten up to the preliminary war jockeying, which is our topic for this first lecture this morning, the Imperialist Encirclement. Now, Bolshevik leaders from Lenin on down knew they would eventually have to fight another great conflict. Lenin's doctrine of keeping the capitalist countries formally divided had begun with the 1922 Rapallo Treaty. However, the de facto alliance could not last forever. And nevertheless, if it were good enough to last long enough for us to prepare for the war, that would be fine. It was the most basic Marxist science that the class struggle had to be played out internationally as well as nationally. We were, after all, after them. And we were devoted internationally as well as nationally. We were, after all, it was our last breath and first aspiration to be the liquidators of the capitalist class worldwide. Likewise, they were devoted to our destruction. There would not be, nor could there be, anything other than a climax to the extant reality, and that meant a class war planet-wide. From 1924 to 1941, as it turned out, we had only 17 years to jockey for the best position from which to fight that battle. Now, from 1917 to 1941, the Red Army and the Red Navy protected our northern frontiers. The then solid ice pack that existed through much of the year, restricting imperialist naval thrusts, was one wall of protection. The Himalayas to the south protected that frontier, as did the South Asian deserts, not to mention the hostility of Europeans of the tribes in Persia, Afghanistan, and northwest China. Imperialism would find it difficult, if not impossible, to launch an attack from there. In short, our problems were east and west. East against Japan and the USA, and west against Germany, Italy, Great Britain, France, and the lesser fascist countries of Iberia and East Europe. Our first line of defense was our military readiness. The point of that spear was our intelligence services. Now, that brings us to Stalin's boys, the Cheka, which stands for the Federal Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation. As you might imagine, had you been running the largest, biggest intelligence operation in history for some 50 years, from 1903 until 1953, you would probably have a special place in your heart for some of your stars. Stalin certainly did, and among those who earned his everlasting affection, several are worth looking at closely for a moment. Let us take a glimpse at several who entered the proletarian secret service after the establishment of the first workers' government and state in the history of nations. Within 6 weeks of the October 1917 seizure, Lenin and the then quite small, that is 7-member, Politburo authorized the creation of the All-Russian, that is Federal, Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation on December 20th, 1917. The Russian initials for this new body led to the use of the term Cheka. Members of the last of the Soviet intelligence agencies, the KGB, are still being paid, the Committee for State Security, and perhaps the most famous were still called Chekas and still being paid on the 20th of the month. That day, the Cheka was created in December 1917 during the Politburo meetings of that date. Now, we've gone over that meeting before, and I'm going to now go to the files. First of all is Felix Dzerzhinsky, Latvian rifleman, 1st Cheka chief. On December 20th, 1917, Lenin and the Politburo were acting on the recommendation of Joseph Stalin and Felix Dzerzhinsky. Stalin was on the Politburo, Dzerzhinsky was not, and at this time there were only 7 Politburo members, and all matters having to do with state security had been handed to Stalin by his colleagues because Lenin wanted it that way. Lenin wanted it that way because Stalin had been acting, when not incarcerated, as chief of all Bolshevik secret financial and other secret activities since 1903. Dzerzhinsky was born into a family of minor nobility in Poland, September 11, 1877. Now, he was often considered to have been of Jewish extraction, but the evidence suggests his family were ethnic Poles and Catholic, as was his successor as head of the Cheka, Vyacheslav Menzinsky. At any rate, Dzerzhinsky had been incarcerated off and on most of his adult life for revolutionary organizing. He had been brutally treated, leaving permanent facial damage, and after the failure of the 1905 revolution, he was in and out of revolutionary activity in Poland and the Baltic nations, and spent the war years in a prison in Moscow until released by the February 1917 revolution. Dzerzhinsky was burning with hatred for his oppressors and the class they served. He had the habit of wearing jackets with the sleeves cut short so that he could show the scars of the manacles that had been on his wrists for many years. In April 1917, he joined with Lenin and the Bolsheviks upon Lenin's return to Petrograd, and in July 1917, he was elevated to the Bolshevik Central Committee at the Stalin-organized Bolshevik Congress in Petrograd. Now, in December 1917, Dzerzhinsky had recruited a special elite armed force made up of Latvian riflemen to act as his agents in his work during the October 1917 seizure. Thereafter, they were the first ever present Praetorian Guard of the Bolshevik Revolution. The 40,000-man Latvian force was composed of 8 regiments. They were bitter about the Imperialist War and joined with the Bolsheviks in April 1917. Whenever Lenin needed loyal shock troops in combat, they turned the tide the Bolshevik way. These two men, Stalin and Dzerzhinsky, became the closest of friends. They saw eye to eye on the nature of the worldwide class struggle and how to conduct it for the people's side. At any rate, Lenin had directed Stalin to prepare the report on the condition confronting the revolution in terms of security and how to fight subversion from the enemies of the people. Now, Stalin had done so and turned the December 20th, 1917 meeting over to Felix Dzerzhinsky. Dzerzhinsky proposed to take command of the new Special Police Commission that the two of them were recommending to Lenin. Its tasks were 1, protecting the revolution's leaders, and 2, guarding the revolution itself. The second file I want you to consider is that of Alexander Orloff. Lev Philby was a young lawyer and scholar who had been drafted into the Tsarist army when restrictions against Jews becoming officers were abolished as a product of the February bourgeois revolution of 1917. Now, Philby was commissioned, and he soon became a Bolshevik, and after the October seizure, he had been recruited by Dzerzhinsky into the Latvian Riflemen Red Guards. Here he was at head when it was decided someone had to try and subvert the Anglo-American invasion from within in the area of Russia north of Petrograd. Dzerzhinsky and his friend Joseph Stalin decided on Philby as one of the two to take charge of that area. Philby was given then a new name in accord with the locality. Chekists would have secret identities at any rate, and Stalin picked the name of Alexander M. Orloff for Philby. Which brings us to Philby or Orloff's romantic years. Orloff and his comrade Maria Rodanslav fell in love. The two were married and together for the rest of their lives. These two were always at the forefront of the global class struggle. In 1918, Orloff and Rodanslav succeeded in bringing the Anglo-American forces at Murmansk into the orbit of the Bolshevik sympathizers. Later, Orloff became the leader of the secret military forces Stalin needed to protect his flanks on the ill-fated Polish-German European campaign of 1920. At any rate, afterwards, Stalin made Orloff the top Chekist for all of Europe. In that capacity, Orloff used Arnold Deutsch to recruit the first 4 of the British Ring of 5. These were Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, and John Cairncross. Along the way, he supervised the recruitment of Michael Straight, a U.S. citizen at Cambridge. Straight was immediately transferred to a U.S. controller, and the Russian government admitted this in a book published in 1993. Orloff had been the Soviet resident in charge of London from September 1934 to October 1935. He operated through Arnold Deutsch, who was the group leader for the Cambridge Five. Then Orloff took direct control of Philby, MacLean, and Burgess in February of 1935, as he was concerned MI5 was closing in on Deutsch. This concern came because Red Army G2 agent Roger Hollis warned Stalin that Deutsch had come under MI5 suspicion as a Soviet agent in Great Britain. As Spycatcher author Peter Wright suspected, Roger Hollis, MI5 chief in the 1950s and 1960s, was not recruited by Orloff but by Red Army G2, and in China, not Europe. Hollis warned Stalin on MI5 closing in on Deutsch. I learned about Hollis in June of 1961 from my KGB contact in London, Lady X, as described in the book The Buccaneer. I had my own go-around with Hollis, as I also described in that book, and subsequently when I was arrested in Italy in December 1961 by U.S. Army counterintelligence, I garnered from their questioning that Hollis was the source of information about not only me, but also the Soviet attempts to protect Philby et al. They beat the shit out of me for 3 days, but being not too bright, they let a lot slip out. For the details of my rescue via Frank Church and the Kennedy brothers, see my book The Buccaneer. Now, Orloff recruited thousands of men and women, especially in Germany, but also in Italy and France, where he served as the resident, that is, chief of intelligence operations for the Chica's Foreign Department. The next file we want to look at is that of Carlos Prieto. It was not until 1962, however, that I discovered from one of my most highly placed sources in the International Red Secret Service, the Mexican communist playwright and one-time Soviet agent, Carlos Prieto, what would become Orloff's greatest accomplishment, namely the penetration of the U.S. government at many levels with one objective. No, not the atom bomb. Half of that job was handed to Steve Nelson, one of 2 of Beria's top atom spy bosses, to run for the Chica. This atomic mission of Nelson's is what Steve Nelson originally told me about in Portland, Oregon in 1963, when he was trying to recruit me. Anyway, Orloff had a more important task, and what could be more important than the atom bomb, you may ask, and I know I did. The answer about Orloff's primary tasks is complex, but it does demonstrate the extreme sophistication of Stalin's personal intelligence expertise, as well as that of his closest associate and fellow Politburo member, Vyacheslav Molotov. In 1936, Stalin confronted a situation leading him to believe that the Rapallo arrangement with the capitalist world was about to give way to a new, united onslaught of the European capitalist class against the USSR, and that he had to get ready for a simultaneous attack from Japan. In other words, all of the world's capitalist countries except the USA would be at war against the USSR and the People's Republic of Mongolia. A two-front war that could not be won. Despite the fantastic progress in Russian industrialization, the fact was that it would take longer than the 10 years Stalin had been talking about to get Russia sufficiently industrialized to win a gross national product World War II against either European bloc, not to mention against the united European bloc allied with Japan, unless the United States were to join with Bolshevism. Now, it was clear by this time, that is 1936, that Bolshevism was not going to seize power in the USA, at least not in the near future. Had that opportunity ever been present, the American communists had missed it, and were now relegated by history to pushing FDR and his New Deal to the left. So how could the U.S. be persuaded under a capitalist government to join with Russia against Europe and Japan? Stalin did not know, however, he felt that the FDR government in the U.S. was at least relatively neutral about the USSR. Some circumstances might emerge that would put the U.S. at war with Germany or Japan. Brigadier General, demoted to Colonel, Billy Mitchell, was not the only one who could see the obvious. A refreshing historical movie starring Gary Cooper is The Court-Martial of Billy Mitchell, an Otto Preminger blockbuster in 1955. In this event, the FDR administration might well ask Russia for its support. Then the practical basis for changing the nature of the Rapallo world from a Soviet-German alliance against the rest of the imperialist countries into a Soviet-North American alliance against the rest of the imperialist countries would exist. Stalin knew if there was anyone in the Chica who could influence U.S. events in this direction, it was Alexander Orloff. Now, the historic strategic decision. Accordingly, in January 1938, Stalin called Orloff back from Spain. There, he was running Cheka operations in support of the Soviet-allied Republican government against Spanish fascist chieftain Francisco Franco, and he had been supervising a secret war against Trotskyites, not to mention overseeing the shipment of Spanish gold to Odessa. Now, Stalin explained to Orloff the importance of his new task. Making this fascinating story too short, let me sum it up by saying Orloff established an elaborate ruse and made his way to New York City along with his wife and daughter. The ruse worked, and when many years later Orloff was discovered living in the USA, he managed to fool his FBI interrogators by convincing them of his, quote, true, unquote, secret refugee status. In fact, they did not find him. Orloff wrote a book claiming to be an enemy of Stalin, and upon its post-World War II 1953 initial partial publication, the FBI read it and got in touch. Now, Stalin could not believe how incompetent these U.S. Americans were. Stalin said to Beria about the U.S. FBI in 1952, "Apparently we're going to have Lev write a book. I can't believe it. How these guys," meaning U.S. intelligence, "survived the war is amazing." Anyway, Orloff did it once, so he could do it again. But that's another story for another book, except to say Stalin read Orloff's report on March 1st, 1953, and the next day had his fatal stroke. Now, Orloff went ahead as planned, presumably because Beria told him to do so, with a series of articles for Life magazine in May of 1953, which later became the core of the book he had cooked up with Stalin. At this time, Beria still entertained the idea he would become the next first secretary. I imagine he might have wanted the same access to Ike that Stalin had to FDR when it was critically important. Orloff's secret access to FDR had been crucially important in getting Harry Hopkins to Moscow in the critical months of 1941 and firming up U.S. support. And there was a new reason by 1953 for Orloff to need the attention of the USA's newest High Leader, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been elected in November 1952, and Stalin wanted to establish contact with the new American president in the same way he had with FDR. Stalin knew Eisenhower, and they had had good personal relations during World War II. Orloff had done it once, he could do it again. Orloff had established direct contact with FDR in a manner later to be used by Albert Einstein. Now, I think some of you readers will see that a great deal of what I'm telling you this morning has not been previously published. And it's one of the advantages you have in this course that nobody else has had before, at least in the formal schooling that I'm familiar with, either in academia or in the secret schools of U.S. Army intelligence. But at any rate, Stalin's comment on U.S. intelligence acumen was simply a remark as to the efficiency of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, which the Russians considered a joke. At any rate, that direct contact between a trusted emissary of one nation and the boss of another was and is an old and distinguished mechanism in the diplomatic corps of many nations over many centuries. Of Stalin's boys, it was Lev Feldman, that is Alexander Orloff, who occupied one of the ventricles of what so many consider to be a rather cold heart. Stalin himself, by the way, felt that way about himself. At least he said after the death of his first wife, "With her passing, my heart turned cold," quote unquote. Now the file on Richard Sorge. When it comes to being the boss's favorite pet, no one stood higher in Stalin's affection than the German Richard Sorge. Sorge began his adulthood as a soldier in the Kaiser's army and was captured and interned in a Russian POW camp. After the capitalist provisional government was established in February of 1917, Sorge made his way back to Germany, where he eventually joined the soon-to-be-formed German Communist Party in the autumn and winter of 1918. There he became a member. When Comintern delegates met with representatives from two other would-be internationals at a conference in April the 2nd to 5th in Berlin, Sorge acted as an armed bodyguard for several delegates, including Finnish Communist Bolshevik leader Otto Kuusinen. Kuusinen recommended Sorge to Cheka boss Felix Dzerzhinsky, and accordingly he was recruited. Now, Kusanen is the man, by the way, who inspired me to join the international communist movement when in June of 1961, a copy of his book, Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, was personally handed to me in London by the chiefs of the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB, and I've told that story in Volume 1 of my autobiography entitled The Buccaneer. At this time, the chiefest foreign operations were at Starovsky Square in Moscow, where Joseph Stalin had his main offices and secretariat. Here Stalin met Sorga for the first time, and the two men hit it off. Sorga had learned Russian while a Tsar's prisoner, and Stalin knew a little German from his years of working in the oil fields of the Black and Caspian Seas. Sorga went on many foreign assignments for Stalin, but the one that changed the world was his mission to Japan. First, Stalin sent him to China, where he built an extensive network in Shanghai, and then as far north as Harbin. There he worked closely with the two North American Comintern agents, Anna Louise Strong and Agnes Smedley. He also recruited several men who would be extremely useful to him and us in the future, and then Stalin sent him to Japan. In Japan, Sorga had a blank check as far as money was concerned. He used his Chinese and Korean apparats, espionage agents, to build a radio system. With that, he could send clear, in the open, verbal communication, as well as code, to Moscow Central. Alternatively, directly to Molotov, which is to say to Stalin, from his base in Tokyo. In the event, Sorga established his radio base near his office, which was in the Nazi embassy in the Japanese capital. Yes, by this time, Sorga had become a lieutenant colonel in the SS intelligence service and had been assigned to this nest of evil in the Nipponese capital. Sorga attended the Japanese General Staff meetings at their request. Their idea was to maintain their connection to Germany at the highest level. Sorga told Stalin that the summer 1939 attack of the Japanese on Mongolia was a test. One faction inside the Japanese General Staff wanted to expand and seize Siberia. They wanted Siberia for all of its natural resources and as a place to attack south and seize all as a place to put their army of unemployed. The other half of the Japanese General Staff wanted to attack south and seize all the colonies of the British, the Dutch, and the French. Along the way, they would expel the North Americans from everywhere in Asia and the Pacific, especially from China. This faction was anxious to take China completely into the Japanese co-prosperity sphere, as they called it. Now, Sorga gave Stalin the detailed order of battle of the Japanese forces on the Mongolian frontier. Stalin saw immediately what Sorga had seen. That was that the Japanese did not have modern equipment and depended on suicidal soldiers to accomplish their missions. Accordingly, Stalin sent General George Zhukov to take command of the most modern land and air machinery the Soviet Union had, including planes and tanks jerked right out of their design institutes and prototype production lines. These new tanks and planes had been perfected as a direct result of our intervention in Spain. They had been the best planes and tanks by far in Spain and had been further improved immediately in the USSR warplats in the years from 1937 to 1939. When Zhukov attacked the Japanese at the end of August 1939 at the Mongolian-China border formed by the Khalkhin-Gol River, there he wiped out the entire 80,000-man infantry in the Japanese Expeditionary Spearhead. And again, Zhukov destroyed what armor they had, as well as their entire committed air force. It was a turkey shoot, as Soviet soldiers took on the Japanese 2-1 with flanking waves of the most modern tanks in the world, supported by the world's first fighter bombers, close air support warplanes. Zhukov employed the new Soviet tactic called deep operations or deep battle. Soviet pilots had flown prototypes of these fighter bombers in Spain to the extreme distress of the Falangist, that is Franco's fascist party, forces attacking Madrid in November 1936. Thereafter, they dominated the air in Spain. In 1938, they turned the tide repeatedly in land and air warfare in Spain. To give you an idea of desert warfare in those days, think of a tank, the T-28s and T-34s, with a heavy cannon capable of accuracy at several miles against a supposedly armored Japanese target. The Japanese tank, unknowing it was being targeted, and in any case unable to do anything but run. Before it could turn and run again and again, Soviet tanks blasted all Japanese tanks and mobile artillery to smithereens. Soviet ground attack fighter bombers, the first Sturmovix, finished off those further away. And in the meantime, charging Soviet infantry took on the men of the Japanese spearhead hand to hand. Russians are a lot bigger than Japanese. These men took the Japs apart like a surgeon gone mad. The Mongolian landscape stank of decaying flesh for the better part of a year. In 1939, an otherwise bad year for us turned terribly wonderful. Japan had assembled another 1,000,000 men to follow their spearhead into Siberia. However, when their spearhead was liquidated, 80,000 men dead, and their armor destroyed, they sat dumb. The Imperial General Staff back in Tokyo was shocked and permanently resolved not to get involved again in Soviet territory. Instead, they decided to move south against the Europeans and the North Americans. This made Pearl Harbor inevitable. Stalin's boys had done it once again. Zhukov and the Red Army men and women, Richard Sorge inside the SS, and Japanese General Staff, all were our greatest generation. Now, preparing for Nazi attack, the delicate balancing act. As 1940 and 1941 unfolded, Stalin arranged his Western forces quietly. Too early obvious preparation for defense against a broad attack might well trigger that attack, even earlier than it was already planned. Too little preparation, and the USSR would not be able to go over to a counterstrike or a preventive attack of its own on Germany. For example, deploying troops and aircraft to the western frontier would be provocative, as seen from the Nazi side. Yet failure to do so would make assault against Nazi Germany a too lengthy process to get underway when the time came. And what if the Germans were to attack in the meantime? Would it be better to have occupied forward positions or deep defensive positions? Now, these were difficult questions. The only certain defense against a German miscalculation was total secrecy on Red Army deployments. Yet certain deployments had to be obvious if the bordering client countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, and the Baltic nations, of the UK, France, and Germany, were to be properly cowed. As we have seen, Stalin wanted to wait one more year before this inevitable war began, or perhaps two, if possible, so he could keep building the Red Army in both men and materiel, and jockey as best he could to prevent a unified capitalist onslaught. In 1 year, he would have an additional 10,000 T-34s, and perhaps that many Sturmovix, more than enough to smash a Nazi attack, or even a London, Berlin, Rome Axis attack. Sorge does it again. 2 years later, Sorge warned Stalin that the Germans were going to attack on June 22, 1941 at 6 a.m. West Soviet time. However, this time Stalin chose not to believe it. He convinced himself that his own SS misinformation bosses had taken in Sorge. Of course, Sorge was right and thus rose in Stalin's esteem. Accordingly, when Sorge next told him that the Japanese had rejected Germany's demand that they enter the war against Russia, Stalin paid attention. The Anti-Comintern Pact of Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain had signed required all of them to come to the aid of any of them involved in a war with other capitalist countries, but primarily the Soviet Union, as indicated by the name. Now he began preparing to shift George Zhukov and his troops from Mongolia and Siberia to the Soviet West. Consequently, Zhukov smashed the Nazis at Moscow in December of 1941, dealing Hitler his first defeat of World War II. Shortly after his final transmission, where he spoke directly with his close friend Joseph Stalin, Sorge was uncovered by the Japanese secret police. He was jailed, tortured, and executed, and the boss's favorite spy passed into the pantheon of Soviet heroes. To this day, Sorge's Japanese grave is the contemporary site of an annual pilgrimage of many communists wishing to pay respect to the boss's favorite. Respect we should pay today. Now let's take the file on Michael Barone. Some of Stalin's boys had been with him in the very early years. One was Michael Barone. After the defeat of the 1905 revolution, Barone, a member of the Bolshevik Party, had fled Russia for the United States, and along the way he met another person, a young Bolshevik woman, and she became his wife and accomplice in Chicago, where they both went to work teaching school and trying to help working people. Then, the capitalist provisional government was established after the February 1917 revolution in Russia, and within 6 months, his own Bolshevik party turned the revolution socialist. The Bolsheviks had seized power in early November 1917 on the U.S. calendar, and Barone then made his way back to Moscow from Chicago. There he renewed his personal friendship with Joseph Stalin, met with Lenin, and following Lenin's advice, was recruited into the Cheka's Foreign Operations Department. Barone went on several missions, including Mexico and the United Kingdom. In Britain, he accomplished much and made his mentors proud, so proud that they sprung him from jail in London and gave him a new assignment, China. In December 1923, Barone arrived in Canton, which is now Guangzhou, China, on a tramp steamer. He came in with 200 dead sheep killed in a typhoon. The Brits were looking for him after the jailbreak in London, so he could not venture anywhere near Hong Kong on his way up the Pearl River, and that was the reason he was on a tramp steamer. If his arrival lacked a certain dignity, that was soon remedied when the rest of his team arrived a few weeks later. Stalin had sent several thousand Soviet advisors and nearly 50 ships full of small arms, tanks, and airplanes. Why? Lenin had argued for and gotten unanimity in the Politburo for a policy of intervening in China to support the creation of a progressive capitalist government under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen. In charge of military operations for Sun Yat-sen was General Blucher, a hero general of the Red Army in the Civil War, and now Lenin's hand-picked chief of Soviet-Chinese military operations in China. Now let's go to the file on Kim Philby. Harold Adrian Russell Kim Philby was the son of a famous, in his own right, British iconoclast, Harry Bridger St. John Philby, Orientalist and Arabianist, who would become the closest personal advisor to Ibn Saud, king of what is now Saudi Arabia. His descendants still rule. St. John Philby engineered the U.S. entrance into Saudi Arabia, cutting out his British compatriots. The Saud family that rules today owes virtually everything they have to him. However, it was St. John's son the world would come to know best. Alexander Orloff, that is Lev Feldman, recruited Kim Philby via Arnold Deutsch and 3 more of the rest of the British Ring of 5. In the UK, he was the resident spy in charge from September 1934 to October 1935 and took personal control of Philby et al. In February 1935. Orloff subsequently guided Kim through the maze of Spain in 1936-37 because he wanted him to have a career in MI6, that is the British Secret Intelligence Service. It took 6 years to get him this far because Kim had rather carelessly let it be known everywhere that he had communist sympathies in the late 20s and early 30s, and this had to be covered up. Now, once inside MI6, Kim rose rapidly because he did such great work. And by this, I mean the work of killing German agents, largely conducted by Stalin's Chekas, who were helping him accomplish his assignments in Iberia. German agents in Spain and Portugal were being shot down like flies, and eventually Kim became chief of the anti-Soviet and anti-communist operations for all of MI6. Along the way, he became a member of the XX, that is 20 committee, so named because these 2 letters together look like a double cross. This referred to the British breaking of the German military code via the machine code-named Enigma and the subsequent formation by Anglo-American Canadian intelligence of the project called Ultra. Now, needless to say, all this data was transmitted to Molotov forthwith. Kim found out about the atom bomb almost immediately, and that meant, of course, Stalin found out immediately. Even more importantly, as a member of the 20X double-cross committee, Philby acquired all of the information he needed to give directly to the boss about Enigma, the machine that broke the German military code by the Brits, and how they did it, which is to say how the machine worked. After the war, Kim was recommended by M to become the next M, really C, but since that is, the head of MI6 was really called C. But since one-time MI6 agent Ian Fleming made the letter M famous as the code name for the MI6 chief, I have used it occasionally in this text. Now then, U.S. President Harry Truman asked that Philby be sent to Washington to guide the American former OSS agents at their request in setting up the U.S. equivalent to MI6, that is, the CIA. As a matter of interest, M is referred to properly as C in the pre-Bond Graham Greene book and Alex Guinness movie, Our Man in Havana, which you can get on video disc form anyway from Netflix. Now, Kim turned down the offer to become M because he said it was more important to help the Americans get into the fight against communism, quote unquote. Kim was in at the beginning and throughout the formation of the CIA and supervised some of its earliest attempts to overthrow Soviet power, the most famous of these being his sabotage of the CIA campaign against communist Albania. Anyway, this story has a long way to go, but I think you get the idea. The gringos certainly did, and spent the next 20 years trying to find moles left behind by Philby without, as far as I know, success. Theory and method in Soviet spy recruiting. As if Stalin did not have enough on his plate at home in the period after 1926, there had been a series of embarrassing Soviet espionage exposés in Western Europe. Some of them had come home to the boss himself, if for no other reason than that Joseph V. Stalin had accepted the working title of the boss, if only by not rejecting it. Now, in 1930, Stalin asked his favorite spy protege, Lev Feldman, to come up with some surefire way of preventing these stupid stumblings from happening ever again. Lev Feldman, that is, Alexander Orloff, was the close friend and sponsor of the Chekists at the Chekists' highest level, Joseph Stalin. He said that the problems with his foreign agents having been uncovered and subsequently tied to him, and the quality of the information being received, could be resolved by making a wholesale change in recruiting policy. Orloff took responsibility for then current mess in European high-level espionage operations. He was the one who had invented the approach of recruiting industrial espionage agents from the working classes who were often engineer-level trained workers. Such men and women were simply not fit for duty of the kind required of persons working as assistants to ministers. They made mistakes due to their class backgrounds that quickly made them suspect or to the secret counterintelligence police agencies of the advanced capitalist countries. Even when they were not at fault, their class backgrounds brought them under suspicion first. I will let Orloff tell the story in his own words. Quote, "This officer, Arnold Deutsch, I point out in parentheses, took account of the fact that in capitalistic countries, lucrative appointments and quick promotion are usually standard to young men who belong to the upper class, especially to the sons of political leaders, high government officials, influential members of parliament, etc. To them, promotion is almost automatic, and it does not surprise anyone if a young man of this background, fresh from college, passes the civil service examinations with the greatest of ease and is suddenly appointed private secretary to a cabinet member and in a few short years assistant to a member of the government." Now, he continues, accordingly, in the early 1930s, the NKVD residenteurs concentrated their energy on the recruitment of young men of influential families. The political climate of that period was very favorable for such an undertaking, and the young generation was receptive to the libertarian theories and to the sublime ideas of making the world safe from the menace of fascism and of abolishing the exploitation of man by man. This was the main theme on which NKVD residenteurs based their appeal to young men who were tired of a tedious life in the stifling atmosphere of their privileged class. And when the young men reached the stage when their thinking made them ripe for joining the Communist Party, they were told that they would be much more useful to the movement if they stayed away from the party, concealed their political views, and entered the revolutionary underground. The idea of joining a secret society held a strong appeal for the young people who dreamed of a better world and of heroic deeds. Unquote from Orloff's book, 1963 book, on pages 108 to 109. Now, Orloff was a genius, as Stalin had recognized many years earlier. In no single area of expertise than that of selecting his chief captains did he excel more. In charge of recruiting the scions of the British ruling class, he appointed Arnold Deutsch. Orloff traveled to London as chief resident spy for the Cheka in 1934, and in that capacity he oversaw Deutsch's work firsthand. In February 1935, after being warned by Stalin that Deutsch was under MI5 surveillance, Orloff took direct command of Philby, Burgess, and McLean. Two more paragraphs from Orloff's 1963 book, entitled Handbook of Intelligence and Guerrilla Warfare, by Alexander Orloff from the University of Michigan Press in Ann Arbor, I'm going to quote to illustrate one of Arnold's main recruiting methods. Quote, a very important part in influencing the young men was played by idealistic young women of various nationalities who already had a smattering of Marxian theory and who had acted as a powerful stimulus which spurred the young converts to action. Having been brought up first by governesses as sissies and later sent to exclusive private schools, they were charmed by the daring Amazons, and their intellectual association with them often blossomed into romances which frequently culminated in marriages. These young men hardly regarded themselves as spies or intelligence agents. They did not want anything for themselves, least of all money. What they wanted was a purpose in life, and it seemed to them they had found it. By their mental makeup and outlook, they reminded me, and most of us, of the young Russian Decembrists of the past century, and they brought into Soviet intelligence the true fervor of new converts and the idealism which their intelligence chiefs had lost long ago. The NKV intelligence no longer worried about attaining promotion for their charges. The promotions came automatically, and the NKVD chiefs looked forward to seeing some of the new recruits in ambassadorial posts in a few years. Unquote, page 109 on that book. Now, thus Feldman, or Orloff, had again persevered, and having taken a severe problem off the boss's plate and in hand, resolved it perfectly. John Caircross, later known within the Cheka circles as a ladies' man type, liked to say that, quote, a woman would always prefer 10% of an outstanding man to 90% of a mediocre man, unquote. This was paraphrasing of George Bernard Shaw's take on these matters, and I suspect he saw himself as belonging to the outstanding man category. At any rate, I see this statement as a logical corollary to Deutsch's Amazon recruiting axiom, at least for the heterosexual two, Philby and John Cairncross, and the bisexual one, Donald MacLean, of the Cambridge Five. Guy Burgess and Anthony Blunt, being homosexual, were beyond Deutsch's Amazon reach and were approached in a different way. Interestingly, the notorious womanizer Kim Philby was known by the codename Sun or Sunny, and Guy Burgess as Little Girl, reflecting, if nothing else, Deutsch's and Orloff's attitude toward their sexuality. Another person of the Amazon type utilized by Stalin was Wallis Simpson. She was recruited in China by Red Army GRU. what I call G2 in this book, along with Roger Hollis, who later at MI5 warned Stalin about MI5 surveillance of Arnold Deutsch. In China, Wallis Simpson was a high-class prostitute recruited via the good offices of Anna Louise Strong. Simpson went on, as we all know, to be the paramour and in fact wife to David, the Prince of Wales, then King Edward VIII, and later the Duke of Windsor. Winston Churchill noted that David Windsor in one of his memoirs as an example of the sad travails of being a royal in Britain. Along the way, Churchill mentions having seen David, while in the early charge of Wallis Simpson, naked after bath, and that he was, to paraphrase, completely shaven from neck to toe like a newborn baby, including his genitalia. Now one can imagine that Amazon Simpson babying her lover and then fucking him to death in those ways only an experienced courtesan of her sort can. Wallis Simpson not simply acquired a laundry list of men and lovers as lovers and husbands before she met the prince, but she had survived in the toughest world of Shanghai prostitution, where one would have to be very competent just to maintain one's head above water. She made short work of David and forever had under her Amazonian spell. Trotskyists and other imperialist historians can't get over being able to describe Orloff's 1938 departure for New York as a defection, despite the exposés now common knowledge, such as provided in this book. I remind the reader that had Orloff really defected, he would have given up Philby et al. Sometime after his establishment of USA residence in 1938. He never did, not even as late as 1953 in his Life magazine articles, when both Philby and Blunt, not to mention Cairncross and Strait, were deep undercover. Philby was being daily examined in London as he was under suspicion for the Burgess McLean defection. Philby was cleared within 3 years by Foreign Minister and future Prime Minister Harold Macmillan in November 1955 in the House of Commons. Not in his subsequent book based on the Life magazine articles, and not in his 1963 book when Philby had already escaped to Moscow did Orloff give him up. In fact, Orloff, who died in 1973, never did give up anybody. So what kind of defection was that? The truth is that the Orloff articles and book were part of a plot cooked up by the boss and his favorite spy, Feldman or Orloff, to establish contact with the new U.S. presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, as they had with FDR in 1939. On March 1, 1953, Stalin read Orloff's first report on his progress in that regard, and the next day, March 2nd, Stalin had his fatal stroke. Orloff went ahead with the Life articles and later book, presumably because Beria, his controller from 1938 on, told him to continue with publication. At that point, Beria thought he would be the next first secretary. He could not have known Nikita S. Khrushchev was plotting a coup that would replace him within weeks, and Beria must have wanted to have the same sub-rosa contact with Ike that Stalin had had with FDR. At any rate, what is a ladies' man? Well, if we set aside the psychopaths who prey upon women for evil purposes, my experience has taught me that what we are usually looking at is a man who prefers the company of women to men, and a man who is fascinated by a beautiful woman's sexuality, or anatomy, with a liberal interpretation of the word beautiful. Such men want to spend as much time as possible with a given woman, usually numerous women, according to travel and life experiences, as a sailor might have in every port. And when the womanizer in question is with that special woman, he is extremely attentive, kind, polite, solicitous, and romantic, and most especially, after these qualities, exciting. Many women, including beautiful women, have never or rarely had that kind of attention, and they appreciate it and respond in kind. Some of them have been mistreated by men, or at least disappointed, and so they are especially appreciative. For this reason, the genre ladies' man does not die out as female liberation proceeds apace. Orloff could have thought of himself and the role of his life of Maria Rodonslov had played in keeping him in the forefront of the Cheka, He might also have thought of his protege Marcus Wolf, the eventual lifelong head of GDR, that is East Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, who was likewise infatuated with his life love, Emma Stenser. Both women were of the Amazon type, and both got their arms early on around the very kind of men the Chica needed more than any other, at least in those years. For more on this, read Wolf's autobiography, Memoirs of a Spy Master, published in 1998 by Random House. Now let us turn to the new breed of spies being recruited in the decade of the 1930s. These new highest-order spies were giving Stalin the kind of information of critical importance to him in defeating the Stanley Baldwin Neville Chamberlain conspiracy against world socialism. Those spies became to be known as the Cambridge Five, or after the appearance of the Magnificent Seven, the Magnificent Five in 1960. Now, as we've seen, Red Army G2 had its own network operating inside Great Britain. But the network that became best known to the world first was that established by Alexander Orloff, that is Lev Feldman, in Great Britain. His chief recruiter was the PhD in chemistry Austrian Jew Arnold Deutsch. Stalin had given Orloff command of West European intelligence operations after 1922, precisely because its focus was on industrial espionage, and it was Orloff who had developed the plan. In this book, you learned how Stalin intended to defeat the capitalist plot to strangle the Soviet Union via trade embargo by lifting all of their scientific and engineering secrets. The way in which Orloff instrumentalized his program was simply to follow the flow of young, technically minded youth into science and especially engineering programs established by capitalist classes in their universities and vocational technical schools in Italy, Austria, Germany, France, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. The eventual prototype of all of these private programs was the one used then and now by Schlumberger. For those of you with an interest, I advise studying how Schlumberger recruits, trains, and deploys their engineering graduates, and you will have the entire story in its best form. Everyone else, for example, Halliburton, Dresser, and Baker Hughes, is just a piss-poor duplication of varying quality, none of it worth a great deal. As Schlumberger expanded with its Soviet base, Orloff used that company to introduce even more of his industrial espionage agents. To see how NL Industries tried to duplicate Schlumberger's program, see my book Third Crusade in the series Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation, book number 6, at Kindle Books. Now, interestingly, the most important scientist of today's Schlumberger family is the actress Léa Seydoux, star of the most recent James Bond epic film Spectre. Léa Seydoux was born in 1985 in Paris, France, to Valérie Schlumberger and the capitalist Henry Seydoux. Her grandfather, Jerome Seydoux, is chairman of PATH, the film company, and her father is a great-grandson of businessman and inventor Marcel Schlumberger. Eventually, Orloff had thousands of controlling agents running well over 100,000 engineering experts in private concerns all over Western Europe, and along the way it was natural he would encounter a few of exceptional quality and ability, and one of these was the 24-year-old University of Vienna PhD in chemistry, Arnold Deutsch. Deutsch came on board about 1924, and therefore was careful from the get-go about not letting his communist sympathies appear in public. In fact, he claimed to be an observant Jew. Accordingly, he was always the perfect man to send anywhere in the capitalist academic regime of whatever European country, and furthermore in Austria he made a reputation in his undergraduate and then graduate years as a person interested in Freudian psychology and sexual politics, a kind of enlightened sexual freedom movement mixed with birth control advice for blue-collar workers of both sexes. The Austrian Vice Squad police took notice of him in this regard, but never for an instant for what he was, an extremely dangerous Comintern and Chica recruiter of industrial spies. In 1932, Orloff sent Deutsch to France, where he built a series of shortwave radio broadcasting ships. These he used to relay industrial espionage information in large quantities directly to Moscow. Orloff personally established secret frontier crossing points for carrying truckloads of engineering documents across the French border from Germany to ships waiting in Holland and Belgium. The many thousands of lower-level Soviet spies in Germany and Italy were producing huge volumes of paper traffic that could no longer be transmitted by wireless. This bulk required a rapid expansion of the Translation Bureau in Moscow. Stalin eventually had to move out of his Staraya Street upper floor to make room for all the new personnel and their equipment. Furthermore, this bulk of paper required sorting by order of magnitude importance that required hundreds of new technical specialists. These people then directed each set of documents to the ultimate end users. Staraya Street in its entirety could not accommodate everything. The entire operation was shifted to a multi-block complex on the outskirts of the capital, and Stalin eventually got his office floor back. Orloff to political espionage. In 1933, Stalin gave Orloff command of an entirely new operation centered on Great Britain. This time it had nothing to do with industrial espionage. This time Stalin wanted Orloff to penetrate the most dangerous of all the capitalist regimes in Europe, that of the Baldwin gang, who were planning on sending Germany against the Soviet Union as soon as they possibly could. Stanley Baldwin was the head of the British Conservative, that is Tory, party from 1923 until 1937, and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom 3 times during that period. In 1937, his understudy, Neville Chamberlain, permanently succeeded him, at least until Hitlerites launched an all-out attack in 1940, and Chamberlain was replaced, along with the Brit pro-fascist foreign policy, by Winston Churchill. In 1933, however, this was all in the future, and meanwhile a temporary glitch had developed in the Brit capitalist plan, that being Hitler's unexpected ascent to power on January 30th, 1933. The majority of Britain's ruling class was terrified of another Cromwell, and they saw Hitler as exactly that. For the moment, Stalin had a breathing space, and he intended on using it to get an accurate view of how the Baldwin plot was unfolding in the coming years. And accordingly, in 1933, Orloff appointed his best man, Arnold Deutsch, to take control of high-level political espionage in Great Britain. Step 1 was the recruitment of Kim Philby in Vienna in 1933. Deutsch sent his first agent, Edith Sushetsky, to London from Vienna in January of 1934. Arnold Deutsch himself arrived in London in early April 1934. Orloff would not be able to follow to London until July of 34. By that time, Edith had recruited her new husband, Alex Tudor Hart, and had cleared the way for the recruitment of Kim Philby into MI6. The Baldwin gang had been sandbagged and didn't even know it. Now, Edith's Vienna communist girlfriend, Litzy Friedman, had married the already committed communist Kim Philby in Vienna in 1933. The two of them arrived in London in May of 34. Litzy was also one of Deutsch's agents, and she prepared Kim to meet her boss. That meeting occurred in London in July 1934. Kim talks about that meeting with Arnold Deutsch in his autobiography, My Silent War, and reams have been written about it ever since. Kim's January 1963 defection. For a cinematic view of the drama, see the Sharon Stone 2004 movie, A Different Loyalty. And with regard to biographies of Kim, let me save you time in sorting through the many books about him by recommending the book I consider the best biography of Kim Philby yet published by the Cap Press, by Genrikh Borovic, called The Philby Files in 1994, Little Brown. Now, Kim introduced Arnold Deutsch to Donald Maclean in August of 1934, and in December Maclean introduced Deutsch to Guy Burgess. Thus the first 3 of the Magnificent 5, Philby, Maclean, and Burgess, were on board with the Chica by the end of 1934. Also in the Season 2's last episode of Sean Bean's Legends,
A new take on Philby's outgoing 1972 work for the Chica is explored, and that was available on Netflix in 2017. Now, in December 1934, Roger Hollis, a Red Army G2 agent in MI5, had warned Stalin that Deutsch had just come under MI5 surveillance. Stalin warned Orloff, whom immediately, in February 35, replaced Deutsch with himself. The Chica operatives had barely escaped detection, but they had escaped. Now their primary mission of penetrating the highest echelons of the Brit ruling oligarchy would get underway. Note that had the latter's defection of Orloff to the U.S. been real, he could have made millions giving away these three, not to mention all the others, but he never did give away anyone. Now the date of Roger Hollis's entry into MI5 is important because the contemporary Brit government places it later in the 1930s for its own reasons. The truth is that Spycatcher author Peter Wright was on the right track when he traced Hollis to recruitment by Soviet Red Army intelligence in China in the 1920s, and his entry into MI6 not long thereafter. Exactly when Hollis went into MI5 is still a state secret in Putin's Russia and obfuscated in the United Kingdom. Chapman Pincher, in his book Treachery, most recent revised edition published in 2011, claims Richard Sorga recruited Hollis in China for the GRU around 1930 to 1931. What I do know is that Hollis was at MI5 in 1934 and that he warned Stalin that December that Arnold Deutsch had just come under surveillance as a possible Soviet agent in England. Now, penetration and Donald Maclean. Donald Maclean was the son of Liberal government education minister Sir Donald Maclean. He first ran the gauntlet of his own communist past, and successfully so. He admitted his youthful Marxism at his interview of August of 1935, one full year after his recruitment into Chica foreign operations. Confronted with the record of his university communism under British communists and Chica agents James Klugman and John Cornforth at Cambridge, Maclean confessed. He stated that he had not altogether thrown off his left sympathies. The examiners were in turn sympathetic and wanted the brilliant young scholar who had aced the examinations. Maclean passed the interview and immediately entered the Foreign Diplomatic Service, and here he had direct access to the inner portals of real power and real policy about Germany and the USSR. John Cornforth went to Spain to fight with independent Marxists from England, but soon joined the Tallman Battalion of mainly German communists. He was killed by the fascists at Lopera on the Cordova front on December 28, 1936. His death led 2 weeks later to the Chica recruiting of the American Michael Straight. James Klugman, whose sister married Maurice Cornforth, a longtime communist theoretician, joined the CPGB in 1933 and acted as a recruiter for the Chica at Cambridge and became a famous communist writer. And that brings us to the file on Guy Burgess. Now, Burgess also had a history of communism in Cambridge. Arnold Deutsch realized that Burgess's homosexuality and brazen attitude about it put him completely outside the then current profile used by MI5, and for that matter, just about anybody else at that time, for what communists would look like in their private lives. Accordingly, in 1935, Deutsch sent Burgess to the far-right, fascist, homosexual type of ruling class highbrow set. Specifically, he directed Burgess to Army Captain Jack McNamara, a Tory fascist MP, and member and leader of the Anglo-German Fellowship, a Brit Nazi front organization with the same kind of outlandish homosexual reputation as Guy Burgess. The two traveled together to Germany and butt-fucked their way through the Nazi Party's equivalent to the less public but just as real left-wing Comintern. When not sucking Nazi cock, Burgess kept himself busy sodomizing the French War Minister Edward Daladier's private secretary, Edward Pfeiffer. During 1936, Burgess worked his way inside the homosexual underground at the BBC in London and through them was made a BBC producer. Keep in mind that in the 1930s, a homosexual who wanted to survive had to hide his sexual preferences as much as an actual foreign agent would have had to hide his true allegiance. This meant that there were many at the BBC, as well as everywhere else, that would help a fellow of their type. Now, as far as his new Chico boss, Theodore Mealy, was concerned, Burgess was inside in more ways than one. In December 1938, Burgess got himself recruited into MI6, which brings us back to Kim Philby. Now, Kim Philby had had a tougher road to hoe. First, there was his own record of Cambridge communism, and the fact that he had been an active communist in Vienna, and he had married a Jewish communist girl. As history would show, MI5 missed most of the Austrian experience. What they did not miss, Hollis was able to get rid of in the years that followed Philby's July 1934 London given Chica directive for him to plan for MI6 penetration. And by the time 1940 rolled around, MI6 had gotten used to recruiting young men who had had a flirtation with communism in college. Everyone agrees Hollis was at MI5 in 1940, and Hollis certainly did clear Philby. In 1935, Philby's biggest problem was his father, St. John Philby, who was from an old and reliable ruling class family in service to the oligarchy. But in India, he had turned anti-British renegade. To get an idea of what an alienated St. John Philby from the British Raj in India looked like, I could recommend the E.M. Forster book and movie, A Passage to India. At any rate, after India, St. John made his way to Arabia, and by the way, they pronounce it as what is obviously St. John as Sinjin, but I don't know why. Anyway, so you may see that from time to time in a movie or TV show. His biggest problem is his father, and in India, his father had become an anti-British renegade, and at any rate, after India, St. John made his way to Arabia and became the key advisor to Ibn Saud, who by this time was the top anti-Brit tribal boss and nominal king of Saudi Arabia. In the latter regard, St. John had rejected Christianity, taking up the Islamic, that is Sunni, religion of the Wahhabi sect, and taken an Arabian wife younger than his son, with his first wife undivorced living in England. Now all of this convinced the lords of Whitehall that his scion, Harold Adrian Russell Kim Philby, should be watched carefully and for a long time before even considering him for membership in their august halls. Accordingly, Orloff kept Philby on ice until history provided the perfect route to the penetration of MI6, which turned out to be Spain. That would not begin until the end of 1936, when Philby arrived in Spain as a foreign correspondent for the Evening Standard. And soon thereafter, he became the correspondent for the London Times, attached to the fascist side in February 1937. By that time, his old London boss, Orloff, was the boss of all Soviet operations in Spain, and it turned into a perfect segue. Burgess got Philby recruited to MI6 in the summer of 1940. Blunt and Hollis saw to it that Philby passed MI5 background scrutiny. Philby then went into the same section as Burgess, which was at first called Section D, that is Guerrilla Operations, and later renamed as the Special Operations Executive, SOE. Along the way, in 1940, his first MI6 assignment was in cryptology, and Kim became a member of the Double Cross XX or 20 Committee, and then he was accordingly read in on the Ultra Decoding Project and the Enigma decoder machine. All of this immediately ended up on Joseph Stalin's Soraya Street desk in Moscow. For an entertaining made-for-TV three-part series about the Brit Ultra code breaking, take a look at the Bletchley Circle at Netflix. And anyway, Anthony Blunt. This brings us to just about the last of these files. Anthony Blunt was the next member of the Magnificent Five to be recruited. He was the first on the potential recruit list of Arnold Deutsch when he returned to London. Deutsch was now definitely out from under the MI5 cloud, thanks to Hollis having ditched all the incriminating reports, and or having explained them as mistakenly interpreted. Deutsch recruited Anthony Blunt in January of 1937. Blunt was in fact the fourth man that the Brit press would be searching for 30 years later, after the Burgess, McLean, and Philby defections. It would take time, however, 40 years, to unmask Blunt, who was recruited into MI5 in the summer of 1940. And he was the fourth Chica spy of the Mag 5 to be recruited. And he was another Cambridge man of correct family and with a brilliant academic record and a homosexual. Blunt was the first of the Chica recruits to be placed inside MI5, as opposed to MI6, where all previous Chica agents had been assigned. And then John Cairncross, the man we discussed before, we wanted to take a look at again. The fifth man in the Ring of Five was Cairncross, not Michael Straight. Straight was recruited in the UK and immediately transferred to a North American control. Cairncross was approached for Soviet controller Theodore Mailey by James Klugeman and then handed to Arnold Deutsch. Deutsch reported to Mailey in May of 37 that Cairncross was on board. All five were recruited in the years from 1934 to 1937. Cairncross had a public reputation as an intellectual communist theoretician at Cambridge, but an even stronger reputation as genius in languages and linguistics. He aced his Foreign Service exam 100 points higher than anyone else that year. But of course he ran into trouble when his communist background was thrown up to him by the interviewing examiners. In May 1937, Deutsch instructed Cairncross in how he would have to proceed to clean up his past. This instruction was done on a park bench at a secret rendezvous in Regent's Park. Cairncross operated inside the Foreign Service from a different office than McLean, so the reports of the two gave a binary 3D stereoscopic perspective to Red intelligence inside the Baldwin-Chamberlain plot against the USSR. And one more comment about Michael Straight. Blunt led Deutsch to the U.S.-American Michael Straight, who was an undergraduate at Cambridge, wealthy and a secret communist. John Cornforth had just been killed 2 weeks earlier, on December 28, 1936, in the Spanish Civil War. John Cornforth and Michael Straight had been close friends at Cambridge, so Straight joined the Chica immediately upon being interviewed by Deutsch, and shortly thereafter he graduated and returned to the U.S., and Deutsch told him to whom to report in New York and gave him half of a picture he, Straight, had drawn to match up with the half his U.S. controller would have. At this point, 1937, Straight moves out of the Cambridge grouping and into a new U.S. group of spies, which is another subject. And we'll conclude with some comments about Orloff. Orloff knew he would need help in London in 1936. He had been notified at the end of 35 that Stalin wanted him back in Moscow permanently no later than 1 March of 36 for a mission that was still unknown to him. Accordingly, Orloff moved Theodore Mailey to London in January of 36. In May of 36, Mailey took over as boss of the Chica's legal residency in the United Kingdom. In the meantime, Philby had joined his mentor, Alexander Orloff, in Spain, and here his control passed to Leonid Itenchen, deputy illegal resident in charge of Spain under Orloff, when Orloff was reassigned to New York in January 1938. Itenchen followed Orloff to the Western Hemisphere and became his chief in charge of Mexico and the Trotsky 1940 assassination. Then the Chica's Latin American organization in 1939. In that capacity, he operationalized the Mexican backdoor to the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos for Orloff and Orloff's new understudy, who arrived in New York in October of 1941 as Master Atom Spy-to-be Alexander Feklisov. Feklisov has written his own book, The Man Behind the Rosenbergs, published by Enigma Books, and written by Feklisov and Sergei Kostin in New York in 2001. Now, in June of 1937, Mailey was recalled to Moscow and Deutsch followed in November of 37. After this time, the entire Mag 5 in London Burgess, McLean, Kirchhoff, and Blunt, and Philby was in Spain, were out of contact with any Cheka control for 9 months. After the cleanup of West European intelligence and the removal of Cheka chief Nikolai Yazov in Moscow and his replacement by Beria, contact was reestablished. In summary, by 1937, McLean and Cairncross were firmly ensconced in the British Foreign Office. Burgess managed to get himself into MI6 in December of 1938. Burgess would clear the way for Philby's recruitment into MI6 in the summer of 1940 with Hollis's MI5 approval. Blunt, who had originally been a Cheka recruit, became the first of the 5 to be inserted into MI5 rather than MI6, and this happened in the summer of 1940. Burgess was perhaps the most energetic of the Mag 5. His success was enhanced by his homosexuality that served to keep him in his perennial bachelor status and thus up and around at all hours of the day and night, making contacts and networking. However that may have been, he was always true, blue, and enthusiastic in his pursuit of espionage goals, whether he had a Soviet controller or not. And also it's important to remember that McLean, Burgess, and Philby were all friends, and all knew of each other's secret roles for Soviet intelligence. And because they were loyal, true, and blue, they could help each other with or without help from Moscow Central, or any controller for that matter. Now finally, Stalin had kept 2 operators, Red Army Intelligence and the Cheka, completely without knowledge that each was running its own network in the UK. This policy had originally been instigated by Felix Dzerzhinsky and continued by the boss after Dzerzhinsky's death without Menzinsky, Yagoda, or Yazov having any idea. The next Cheka chief to know this would be Lavrenti Beria, and that brings us to a conclusion of this lecture, which was the first of the series of 4 about the period immediately preceding the Second World War.